was six shooters. And it was understood in that crowd that the first person who spoke up against me just might get shot. That was a very well-behaved audience. So as I said, I know your state very well. I have been back here multiple times. Matter of fact, I was back just a few months after that. On my first hunt in Colorado in the Western Slope, and outside of the town of Meeker, I've got quite a few good mountain lions on that hunt, and was introduced to the White River region, and that became actually one of the first national forests that I named once I became president of the United States. I was here again as president in 1905 on a bear hunt in the spring of '05. I was back just the next year, in fact, as Vice President of the United States to help you celebrate your quarto centennial in 1901. And you'd be amazed at what a different reception I got from the people of Victor, Colorado. They bent over backwards to see that the previous year's memory would be erased, and they showed me all around the mining and the extraction industries there and gave me a very fine reception. So I have forgiven the people of Victor. I understand it was a once-off, as they say. So I do. I feel as much a Westerner as an Easterner. And they even called me the cowboy president. I wear the hat just to remind you of that sometimes. Cowboy president. It is a wonder that my legacy would be so intertwined with the Western states, with the wide open spaces of the cowboys and the ranchmen and the Western national parks and national forests and game preserves, that my legacy would even be included as a big game hunter on multiple continents even, and an explorer, and somebody who led American forces into battle in foreign soil, that I would be the exemplar of the strenuous life. This would come as a great surprise to people who knew me in my childhood as a weak and sickly little child growing up in a very well-to-do family of Dutch businessmen, growing up at a brownstone at 28 East 20th Street in New York City. And then as a young man going off to Harvard College. How does this man become associated with the West? Well, I was an avid reader. And all of my childhood, my childhood heroes through reading had been men like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone and Kit Carson and Lewis and Clark and it was the tales of the defense of the Alamo. These were the heroic stories of the West that that had inculcated in me this desire to see the West one day. And as yet very many young Eastern men of means, I fashioned myself a big game hunter. So I started subscribing to the gentlemen's hunting journals like the Forest and Stream magazine, and I knew that the bison, which were a symbolic Western creature in America, they had grown the plains by tens of millions, and within a handful of decades, their numbers had been dwindled down to a mere thousands by the senseless market hunting and the introduction of the transcontinental railway into the western U.S. And all I could think of was, I wanted to get one before they were all gone. So off I went to the Dakota Territory, Western Dakota, 1883, and in those days the Northern Pacific Railway was still being constructed, and one of its further western terminus would be where it crossed the Little Missouri River in the Dakota Territory near the town of today would be Medora, North Dakota. And I got off and I hired, I was a young dude from the east, and I brought along a cowboy hat. I had some chaps made in the east, and I had my 6 shooters and my rifle and my silver belt buckle and silver spurs and my silver jeweled knife made at Tiffany's in New York City. And I was the cowboy, the western rancher, and western hunter. And I got a bull buffalo that you can still see today on the walls of the North Room in Sagamore Hill, my home in Long Island, off New York City. But while I was there, I fell in love with the grand beauty, that desolate beauty of the Badlands of the Dakota Territory. And if you've been there, perhaps you know, I felt that the Badlands looked as I felt Edgar Allan Poe wrote neighbor said it looked like hell with the fires put out. But I fell in love with that desolate beauty. And I fell in love with the idea of being a ranchman. So on the spot, I wrote out a check and I purchased a working cattle ranch, the Maltese Cross Ranch. And just like that, I was a cattle rancher in the Dakota Territory. You can just imagine how excited my young pregnant wife back in New York City would be to find out, without consulting her, we were now cattle ranchers. It was only a year later that I returned to that ranch in the Dakota Territory under very different circumstances. A broken man, as it were. You see, I had lost on a single day the two most important women in my life. My mother, Mitty, at the age of 49, succumbed to typhoid fever. And in our same house in New York City, on the same day, St. Valentine's Day of 1884, I held my dying young wife in my arms, and she died also of a kidney failure that had been masked by her pregnancy. For only the day before, she had delivered our first child, a young girl I named Alice. And I was so distraught, I knew not what to do with myself. My friend said, we know not what Theodore will do. He's not in his right mind. And after a double funeral for my wife and my mother, I buried myself in the work as a young New York assemblyman. I had been the youngest elected New York assemblyman in state history at the age of 23. I buried myself in the work of legislation, and at the end of that term, I recalled the words of my father, who said, "Lack care rarely catches up with a rider whose pace is swift enough. Lack care seldom overtakes that rider whose pace is swift enough." You see, I had just a few years earlier lost also that hero of my life, the greatest man I ever knew, my father. We called him Greatheart in the family after the character in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. He was the greatest man I ever knew, and he succumbed at the age of 46 to stomach cancer. While I was away at Harvard, I wasn't even able to get back before he passed. So now at the age of 25, I had lost the three most important people to me in the world. And I left my young newborn daughter Alice in the care of my oldest sister Barry, and I retreated to what was essentially my fortress of solitude in the Dakota Badlands, my ranch. And I had another ranch home built I called the Elkhorn, constructed even further away from civilization, which is saying much in the Dakotas. And I buried myself and my grief in 16 to 18-hour days on horseback as a ranchman in the roundups, through the bitter cold and the bitter heat. For the next couple of years, I began to work off my grief. And I wrote it, and I began to write. I began to write books, what would become a number of books about my time as a Dakota ranchman and a big game hunter ranging through the West. And in time, my grief began to heal. And I wrote of that place that it was still the Wild West in those days. The West of Owen Vista's writings and Remington's paintings and sculptures. It was a West where you still saw the frontier soldier and the Indian, and it was the West of the open range cattle ranches and the cow punchers. You could pass through for days without seeing another person, and you could just ride. The game would stare at the passing horseman. We knew toil and hardship, and hunger and thirst, but ours was the thrill of work, the joy of living. We felt the beat of hardy life in our veins. in time, I would say that the romance of my life was rekindled in the Badlands. I felt healed by my time in the West. I was healed in the West. And I have said later that I would not have achieved much that I have in life, to include the presidency, were it not for my time spent as a ranchman in the waning days of the wild western frontier. Now, over those couple of years, I had invested about a third of my family inheritance, which was several $1 million. I was well to do. Didn't have to worry where the next meal was coming from. I had invested about a third of my total inheritance in the cattle business. And I lost my shirt in the cattle business of the Dakotas. I had purchased hundreds and thousands of cattle just in time for the very worst blizzards in Dakota Territory history, 1886-87. Lost about 70% of my herds and started to lose my taste for ranching. I began to divide more and more of my time between West and East, and then something very surprising happened. I reconnected with a childhood friend, Edith Carew, and I fell in love again. We were married soon thereafter, and we went on to raise 6 Roosevelt children. Like my wife Edie likes to tease, she raised 7 children, and I could be her worstest and least behaved. But over the next few years, I settled down to a settled family life back in the East, Washington, D.C., and then New York City. I settled into federal work and U.S. Civil Service Commission. I thank you for that kind introduction there. But yes, the U.S. Civil Service work, and then was asked to head up the New York City Police Board. You said, well, Mr. Roosevelt, what in the world qualified you for those positions? I don't know. What I do know is something I have lived by in my life is this rule: when somebody asks you if you can do a job, you say, certainly I can. And then you get busy figuring out how to do it. And that's what I did in my work in the police commission. But then 1896 rolls around and William McKinley, a senator, was going to run for the presidency from the Republican Party. And I saw an opportunity. Perhaps if I campaigned for this man, I could perhaps get some sort of a lower position in his administration, get ourselves back to Washington, D.C., and maybe re-enter elective politics again. You see, I had tried to dabble in politics. I said that I had been the youngest elected New York assemblyman at the age of 23, and I think that's still the case, youngest ever. And I had run for political office again as the mayor of New York City, my hometown. And there were 3 candidates, and I came in third. Not a stelling start to my political career. So the federal job sounded pretty good at the time. It put bread on the table. I continued to write through all of this time. That's something that you know that I've never been very good with money. Even as president, Edie would put $10 to $20 in my pocket in the morning, and by the end of the day, I could never tell how in the world I had spent it. The next day, there'd be another $10 in my pocket. Edie took care of the books. Never been very good with money. But I continued to write. I wrote over 40 books in my lifetime, and every experience I lived in my life, I ended up writing about it. I was my own best publicist, as it turns out. So this 1896 election, Mr. McKinley wins, and at the age of 39, I got my dream job, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And I know what you're thinking. Well, the Roosevelts are not sailors. What in the world qualifies you to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy? Well, you see, I wrote a book. I don't know what you did your senior year in college, but I wrote a book called The Naval War of 1812. I knew nothing of sailing, but I enjoyed history. And I studied about the War of 1812, and I determined that Mr. Jefferson probably one of our worst presidents, had so ill prepared the nation's defense that our lack of military preparedness had brought on the contempt of the British Empire and had brought about the War of 1812. And only through the exceptional heroism of our naval heroes there of that war did we eventually make a showing of ourselves. But that made a lasting impression on the people who matter. And that book actually became required reading in the British Navy. And it was in line with much of the thinking of the day. One man, Admiral Mahan, was a great naval theorist of the time who said that all great nations have been sailing nations. You have to be a sailing nation to be a great nation. That you have to project, if you want to continue to grow and project your commerce, you have to be projecting overseas. That's a commercial navy. A commercial navy must be backed up by a military might and coaling stations throughout the oceans. I was firmly in line with this idea. So as Assistant Secretary of the Navy now, I was the equivalent of a four-star admiral, Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the age of 39. And thankfully, the Secretary of the Navy wasn't particularly excited about his own position and took regular trips back to his home and left me in charge. Which is bully, by the way. I had my own navy to move around, and I did everything within my power in that next year to prepare America and grow our navy, to prepare us for what I believed to be a coming conflict with the Spanish Empire. You see, I preached with all my fervor and the zeal that I possessed in that year as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, that it was not only would be righteous but advantageous to America if we would rid the Western Hemisphere once and for all of this last vestige of this European colonialism. There was a humanitarian disaster 90 miles off of our Florida shores. The Cuban people were rebelling against this terrible treatment of the Spanish Empire. And as empires do, there was a backlash against this, and a humanitarian disaster was on their hands. Perhaps 250,000 people had died of dysentery and disease in these concentration camps. The idea was to separate the theoretically peaceful town people from the rebels in the field, but these concentrated towns were just disease-ridden cesspools. 250,000 people in those couple of years were dying on our shores. And we had a humanitarian requirement, I believed. But we also, it wouldn't hurt if we had control of the island of Cuba, and maybe Puerto Rico, and maybe a few of the other Spanish possessions along the way. But if that was God's will, then so be it. So I had fought for this war, and then Mr. McKinley, in February of 1898, and you may know some of this story, but we were concerned about some of the violence that was happening down in Havana, and concerned for the safety and security of some of the Americans who were on the island of Cuba. So we sent down the battleship USS Maine in February of 1898 to show the American flag, not as a sign of bellicosity. But then something happened. Changed the course of our American history. The USS Maine was blown up. It blew up, killing 266 American sailors and Marines on board, most of the crew. And what did Mr. McKinley do? He waited. He didn't declare war. He stood by. He was a cautious man. You see, he had been a major. He served as a captain and then a major in the American Civil War. And he said he had seen the dead stacked up like cordwood and wasn't about to be in a mood to be president and see any more Americans die. So there was a naval investigation done, and it took an interminable amount of time. About a month and a half, we had to wait for the results of this naval investigation of what happened to the USS Maine, and it turns out that they thought that there was some sort of an external explosion. That sealed it for me. The Spanish had to have done it. Had to have been a planted mine. Within a few days, America was at war with the Spanish Empire over the island of Cuba. And I immediately asked to resign my position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy so that I could go down and become an officer in some capacity in the land forces that were to invade the island of Cuba that I knew surely was to come. You see, I was not about to be one of those armchair jingos who shriek for war, and then at the first opportunity to put your own body in harm's way, you sit back in cowardice and send others to die in your place. I was determined that I would be the one to shed my blood for the policy that I had helped bring about. No one was to go in my place. This seemed a foolish venture to most of our friends and family, probably to Edith included. They said, how can you run off to Cuba? You have a very good job and possibly a promising future in politics. Who knows? You may rise to something beyond Assistant Secretary of the Navy someday. Who knows? Why would you risk that to go off and put your body in harm's way and leave possibly your wife a widow and your 6 Roosevelt children as fatherless? How could you do that? But Edie knew. She knew my heart. I wanted to leave a name worth remembering for the Roosevelt children. No man who lives a life of ease throughout history has left a name worth remembering. And I was determined to leave a name worth remembering to the 6 Roosevelt children. To my great delight, Congress had approved the raising of 3 volunteer regiments, mostly to be raised from the Western Territories. And it's good to have friends in high places. It's good to work directly for the President of the United States. And I asked if I could be a part of one of those regiments. And my good friend, Leonard Wood, I said, should be the commander of that regiment. I would be the number 2. It would take me several weeks of military experience before I would be qualified to move up to the command of that unit, probably. It would take several weeks. Leonard Wood had been a career officer. He had served as a surgeon in the U.S. Army, and on detached duty, he had actually pursued Geronimo down to the Southwestern Territories, and for that heroic effort, he had earned the Medal of Honor. He was the personal physician to President William McKinley and Mrs. McKinley. So guess what? We got our regiment. We became the first United States Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, later known in the press as the Rough Riders. Now, I was initially opposed to this idea of being called the Rough Riders because I didn't want to be confused with no disrespect towards Buffalo Bill, but I didn't want to be associated with this hippodrome affair of the Wild West shows of Buffalo Bill. He called his troop the Rough Riders. But you know what? The American people seemed really taken with the idea, and I'm no fool. I know good publicity when I see it. The Rough Riders it was. And we started training down in San Antonio, just outside of the Alamo, a very fitting place for this group of wild Western recruits. You see, we were mostly recruited out of the Western Territories of the Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory, the New Mexico and Arizona territories. Mostly they were to be cowpunchers and Western miners and ranchmen, but there was a goodly amount of all sorts of occupations. We even had one unfortunate gentleman who worked for the Internal Revenue Service who joined our regiment. And then when Congress authorized an increase from about 700 individuals to 1,000 per regiment, I saw the opportunity to add in a goodly mix of Eastern aristocratic men from good colleges and good families. Men from New York, from good solid families, Harvard men and Yale men. So we were a very curious bunch, and we captured the American curiosity, and the reporters flocked to our training grounds outside of the Alamo in San Antonio, and every day there would be more and more and more reporters showing up just to cover us in training. And they were taking pictures, and the pictures were making it into the front pages. We hadn't even gone off to war yet. We're making the front pages of newspapers across the country. Here's a picture of the Rough Riders shooting their weapons. Here's a picture of the Rough Riders cooking over an open campfire. Here's the Rough Riders pitching a tent. Here's the Rough Riders brushing their teeth. Any number of pictures, anything sold if it was called the Rough Riders. We knew we had only a handful of weeks to get these men into condition, get them trained. These were already men who knew how to handle themselves on a horse. We were a cavalry regiment, after all. These were mostly men who knew how to shoot. Even the Easterners, many of these were the strapping college athletes of the East Coast Ivy League schools. We had the captain of the crew of Harvard. We had men from the polo team. We had the captain of the American polo team in the Rough Riders. We had the number 1 and the number 2 rated tennis players in the world in our regiment, who just happened to be Harvard men. And we knew if we were going to get to Cuba, we had to be ready at the quickest opportunity. As it turns out, we had about 3 weeks of training together as a regiment before we were given the orders to ship off to Tampa, Florida, which was the embarkation point for loading onto a number of ships to get us down to Cuba. We rushed ourselves across the country, and as we went along on the train through the Old South, remember this is just a third of a century following the American Civil War. And everywhere we went, we saw the stars and stripes being waved, and every town that we went through cheered for the Rough Riders that they knew were on their way to Cuba. So the Spanish-American War was a bully war that brought the nation together, that healed those remaining wounds of the American Civil War, that brought North and South together. Mr. McKinley very wisely appointed the head of the Volunteer Cavalry Division to be a man named Joe Wheeler. He was a congressman from the South. He had been a cavalry general fighting for the Confederacy in the American Civil War. And now here he was as a 2-star cavalry general leading the American forces down into Cuba. A brilliant turn of political acumen by President McKinley. So we made our way down to Cuba, as you know. Unfortunately, because of a lack of transports, we couldn't take our horses with us. So here we were, a cavalry unit without horses. Some of the other regiments, who were just a little on the jealous side of all the public attention that we were getting, started referring to us as Colonel Wood's weary walkers. We made our way to Cuba, and as you may know, our fateful day on the 1st of July, 1898, what I called my crowded hour, fortuitously, there had been senior commanders who had gotten sick with the yellow fever, and everybody gets promoted when that happens. Colonel Wood got moved up to the brigade level as a 1-star general, and I, on the crowning day of our regiment's glory, was going to be the colonel, the commander of the Rough Riders, as we took Kettle Hill and then on to San Juan Hill. Some of you may know some of the exploits, but we were to be in support of the active duty military units as a reserve cavalry unit, volunteer cavalry unit. But when I received the orders that we were to take Kettle Hill in support of the other forces, I took my men through the other regiments, were marching forward, and I was the only one on a horse. And I find myself at the head of this entire division of active duty forces along with our volunteer regiment, And I said, we're going to take the hill. And those captains of the other regiments said, we don't have the orders to do so. I said, I'm looking around. Well, I'm the senior officer here, and I say we take the hill. So you can either come with us or watch us. They said, we'll be damned if some volunteer regiment gets all the glory of taking that hill. So off we went. It was this mix of all these various regiments. It was we had the 9th and the 10th Colored Cavalry alongside us, and the Rough Riders took Kettle Hill, and then we took on the support as the other forces were taking San Juan Hill and the ridge line there, and we went in support of that and planted the American flag on San Juan Hill. And within a few weeks, the war was over. My entire military career spanned about 3.5 months. But I had made friends with what was the leading reporter of the day, was embedded, as you would say today, in our regiment, and was writing regular stories that were being reported nationwide. I would say it's good to have the press on your side. But as I said, I was my own best publicist. And as one politician would later say, history will be kind to me, for I intend to write it. Which is exactly what I did after the war. No sooner than we returned that I started writing up the history of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. And what do you suppose I called that book? Not the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry Regiment's history, but The Rough Riders! Became a national bestseller. Catapulted me into the status of an American war hero, one of the most recognizable names in all of America. And no sooner had we returned to New York in quarantine than the Republican Party in the state of New York came to me and wanted to run me for the governorship within the next month, the state of New York. I was now suddenly somebody in demand in the state of New York. Only a few years earlier, I came in 3rd out of 3 people for the New York City mayoral race. And now they wanted to run me as the Republican nominee for the governor of the state of New York. I had 1 month to campaign. I know we're all campaigns only 1 month long. I was the most recognizable name, a New York man who had become a national war hero. Many people were talking about the award of the Medal of Honor. And it wasn't just me who was talking about that. But many were talking about that. So after 1 month of campaigning through the state of New York, and I had my boys with me, some of the Rough Riders, they were still in their uniforms, in fact, when they started campaigning with me. And we would ride the train through the various towns and burgs, anywhere there was a train stop in the state of New York. We would stop, and our bugler, our regimental bugler, M.A.O. Cassie, Private Cassie, he would sound the regimental call, and the local band in town would be assembled there, and they would strike up a good rendition of There'll Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight, which had been a de facto regimental song. And there would be Stars and Stripes Forever, a very patriotic affair. And I found that the people of New York weren't particularly interested about what I had to say or think about the issues of the day in the state of New York. They mostly wanted to see me in the flesh, this New York boy who had made good and become a national war hero. And they mostly just wanted to hear stories of the Rough Riders in Cuba. So guess what? That's what they got! One day, one of my sergeants, Buck Taylor, he'd been a Texas Ranger down before the war. He came up to me and said, "Colonel, it would be a tremendous honor if you would let me introduce you before the people at the next stop." Now, how was I to say no to this? So Buck gets up when the train stops, and the band had played, and it was his time to speak, and he stands before the people of this town, and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you here to my Colonel, Theodore Roosevelt, greatest man I know. And I think when you get to know him as I knows him, that you'll love him too. You see, he promised us there'd be some hard fighting and dying in Cuba, and he was with us every step of the way. When it came time to that glorious day for us to plant the American flag atop San Juan Hill, he led us like sheep to the slaughter. And when he's your governor, he'll do the same for you." This hardly seemed a testament of my military skill. But that crowd just ate it up. It seemed to do me nothing but good. You see, I won that election, and now at the age of 40, I was the governor of the state of New York. Pretty good start, as it were. As it turns out, you see, I had, over the years, begun to develop more and more of an attitude of progressivism, a need for reforms within the Republican Party. You see, it was never a question that I was going to be a Republican. The party of Lincoln, the party of my father. But I saw the need for reforms within the party. Some may have compared me to Martin Luther, trying to start a new denomination. That was never my intent. I simply wanted to reform the party that I loved from within and move people in the direction that I felt that needed to go. And now that I was the chief executive of the state of New York, I was in the position to do so. The problem was, the party bosses, Senator Platt, who was the party machinery boss in the state of New York, he had different ideas, you see. He imagined that I was just going to give a rubber stamp to all of his choices for the positions of any importance within the state of New York, and I had other ideas in mind. Mr. Platt and I began to butt heads on more and more issues, but in particular, the Commission of Insurance. You see, the Commission of Insurance is a very important position within the state, and I wanted to put one of my own men, and Mr. Platt wanted to put his man in charge, who had seen forth to rubber stamp corruption after corruption within the state. You see, I'm not against wealth in itself. I have been accused of being a traitor to my class. I'm not against wealth in and of itself. Capitalism is still the foundation for this American republic. But it is what I describe as the malefactors of great wealth who want to use special privilege of wealth to interject themselves into the political process. Special interests have been the problem with this nation. There has always been the struggle between those who have and those who have not. And my reforms that I was trying to push within the state of New York ruffled enough feathers that Senator Platt and his cronies, who controlled the party machinery behind the scenes, you would think the governor did that, but this was a different time, I tell you. They began to search about for ways to get rid of me out of the state of New York. Short of homicide, I suppose. And they began to cast about, how in the world do we get rid of Roosevelt? We do not want this man running for re-election in 1900 for the governorship. Then it dawned on them, perhaps Roosevelt could be kicked upstairs to one of the least significant positions in all of American government, the vice presidency. You see, there was an opening. Mr. McKinley's vice president, William Hobart, had died just the previous December. And in fact, you may not know this, he was the 6th vice president in American history to die in office. I suppose Senator Platt hoped that I might be lucky number 7. So they got the ear of the President of the United States and convinced him that they needed a young, energetic, enthusiastic, popular war hero on the ticket in the year 1900. In other words, me. I wanted to become governor again. I enjoyed the governorship. But I understood little by little. I was actually told by Senator Platt, I would just as soon stand under the Niagara Falls and attempt to spit it back up than to try to reject the nomination for the vice presidency in the year of 1900. So as a good Republican soldier, I saluted and off I went on that campaign tour of 1900 that I described earlier that took me here to the state of Colorado and to that terrible reception. And as you know, we won that election in 1900, defeated once again that populist William Jennings Bryan. He ran 4 times, you know, for the presidency, lost every time. But I was elected Vice President of the United States of America. I was 42 years old. Then it dawned on me, I'm Vice President of the United States of America. I have just been relegated to a political wasteland. One of Mr. McKinley's closest friends, Mark Hanna, senator, he had warned Mr. McKinley against me. He said, don't you understand, sir, that madman is only one life away from the presidency? Well, you may know, it was only 6 months into our administration, in September of 1901, when a madman anarchist went up to President McKinley, who was at the Buffalo Exposition, Buffalo, New York, and shot him point blank in the stomach. Didn't kill him. The bullet was lodged in the stomach, and the doctors knew they couldn't operate. Now, I was rushed to his bedside, and there in Buffalo, in the hospital in Buffalo, New York. And I sat with him for 2 to 3 days. I sat with him, waiting for some change in his health. And at some point, I began to feel a bit like a vulture, just waiting for death. And the doctor said, it looks as if his condition might be improving. Why don't you take off, Mr. Roosevelt? It looks as if he's going to recover. And so here I was in my native state of New York, and well, I did what any reasonable man would do. I went off on a hiking trip, the highest point in New York, and took my family on a hiking trip to Mount Marcy on the other side of the state. And it was only a few days later that after I had climbed to the peak of Mount Marcy and I was starting to descend the mountain, that a messenger came up, panting out of breath with some papers in his hand, and I knew what the news was. Mr. McKinley had taken a turn for the worst, and I was to return to Buffalo as quick as I could. So through the night and into the morning, I rode the train back as fast as I could across the state, arriving in time to find out that Mr. McKinley had perished, and that I, Theodore Roosevelt, at the age of 42, in a borrowed frock coat, was to take the oath of office as the 26th President of the United States of America. And I'm told that those Republican Party leaders said, now look what has happened. The damn cowboy is in the White House. What a good cowboy ride it has been. I would say no one has enjoyed being president as much as I have. And no family has enjoyed the White House as much as the Roosevelt family. 6 children, imagine that, 6 children ranging in ages 4 to 17 in the White House. It was a bully time. I've had a bully time being the President of the United States. If I thought being in charge of New York State was great, being president was even better. And I have butted heads with Congress on more than, well, perhaps on a daily basis at times. And I've been pleased with the record of my administration. During our administration, we've been able to broker the peace in what could have turned into a global conflict, a war between Russia and the Japanese Empire. So, ending the Russian-Japanese war. You may know that I got myself involved in a little bit of ditch digging down in South America, Central America. I said, I took Panama and left Congress to debate me about it. You see, there was a revolution that took place. Panama had been part of, it was that little extension off of Colombia, and for years the Congress had been debating what should we do about constructing a canal through the middle of Central America. And they hemmed and hawed for years and years and years without getting anything done. When I found out that a number of people were trying to work towards independence in Panama, declare independence from the nation of Colombia, I didn't exactly send in troops, but I did send down a warship that might have prevented the Colombian nation from getting their troops in that way, and I may have been responsible for the closing down of the railways between Colombia and Panama. And coincidentally, then, the Panamanians declared independence, and the very next day the United States recognized the independence of the new nation of Panama. And just like that, we initiated a contract with the new nation of Panama for the construction of a canal. That canal that finally came about after my presidency. I became the first president in American history to leave the country while in office. I went down to investigate the construction, the progress of construction down in Panama. It's a bully good bit of engineering. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to do so. They even let me operate the steam shovel, which was bully good fun. We, as you know, we have worked towards reforms within big business. I have been known as the trust buster. Again, I'm not trying to denigrate all of capitalism. Capitalism is still the foundation of our country, but when you have a combination within business that gets to the point where a monopoly strangles out all the competition, then you know what can happen. There were laws on the books that were intended to prevent the over-combination within industry that were not being enforced. I'm simply trying to put some teeth into the enforcement of those laws. I firmly believe that there should be some sort of a government control over the financial industries in this country. There should be something akin to a securities exchange, a commission of sort. Perhaps that is in your nation's future. I've become more and more progressive in my ideas for this American Republic. Constitution never gives the right of corporations the right to vote. We need to get corporate money out of politics. We need to eliminate the special interest. I was for what I described as the square deal for the American people. An equality of opportunity, not an equality of outcomes, but an equality of opportunity. And perhaps not even just a better enforcement of the existing laws. Perhaps we may even need to change up the laws of this country to enable an equal footing of opportunity for all Americans. I said this will never be a good country for us to live in until it is a reasonable good country for all of us to live in. And I was perhaps most progressive on the topic of conservation. Now, you know I'm a big game hunter, and I went on to kill thousands of animals after my presidency on a Smithsonian expedition for a year in Eastern Africa. But before you go getting too righteous on me, you good people of Park County, you know that hunters, game hunters, responsible game hunters, are the original conservationists in this country. And on the topic of conservation, I believe that we have been given much in this country. We built this country up through the 1800s. We built this country up on our natural resources, but they are not inexhaustible. But we treated our resources as if they were inexhaustible, that they would never have an end. Living in the West, I saw firsthand the dangers of unregulated mineral extraction, of clear-cutting of our forests, of market hunting of our big game creatures to the point of near extermination, of the pollution of our rivers, overgrazing to the point of turning our western states into deserts. I had seen these things with my own eyes. I'm a bird person, some of you might know this. Birds are probably one of my favorite creatures. And as President of the United States, I had been involved in something that the federal government had never done before. You see, some of the birders down in Florida, the Audubon societies within the South, I started getting piles and piles of letters when I was just president, saying that the feather hunters, once again this year, are going to slaughter the migratory birds in the southern keys of Florida, and their little hatchlings are going to die of starvation once again this year. How many years can we continue to allow this to happen? You see, the fashions of the day, which never make sense, women's fashions, dictated that women at the turn of the century should wear these tremendous plumes of these migratory birds on their hats, and in some cases even full birds on their heads, and hummingbirds as little pendants on their dresses. This is disgraceful, a disgraceful waste. This is just a wanton destruction of natural resources. And so I brought in my legal counsel, Philander Knox, and I said, is there anything within the Constitution or the laws of America which would allow me to name Pelican Island down here in southern Florida a federal game preserve? And he said, no, sir, I don't believe there's anything in the laws which would enable you to do so. Let me ask you a more interesting question. Is there anything in the laws of the Constitution which prevent me from naming Pelican Island as a federal game preserve? He came back a little bit later and said, no, sir, I don't believe there is. I said, there you go, I so declare it. Pelican Island is now a federal game preserve. For the first time, the federal government was going to be responsible for overseeing the protection of helpless creatures. And some of you know who like to follow game, whether you're hunters or just aficionados who like to follow wildlife, you know that we need protected places. This is something that the Boone and Crockett Club had argued for, is that we need habitats for these creatures. If we want to maintain and conserve these creatures, we need habitats. And for migratory creatures, it's not enough to set up one little spot where the birds can come in and roost. You need a string of pearls, as it were. One refuge after the next that the birds can safely fly to and be protected. So in my administration, before it was over, I created 51 federal bird preserves. 51. The first 51. And that's become the basis of today's over 500 refuges, which are part of the National Wildlife Refuge, which are managed by the Fish and Wildlife Association today. In my administration, I set aside 150 million acres of federal forests protected by the federal government, 16 of which are right here in the state of Colorado. To include that forest over there in the White River, the first one that I saw hunting those mountain lions in 1901. It takes an act of Congress to create a national park, The president alone cannot create a national park. Were it so, I would have created dozens in my administration. It takes an act of Congress to do so. And Congress at that point was led by a man of my own party, the head of the House of Representatives, Joe Cannon, who had famously said, "Not one red cent for scenery." You know that the national parks are more than simple scenery. They are worthy of protection in and of their own right as scenery, yes, but you know that these are places where you can go and recharge. These are the nation's playgrounds. This is the type of scenery that restored my body, my soul, my mind, and my grief. And it can be that for all Americans. That is what the great promise of our national parks. It belongs to all of the people. So in my administration, I was able to approve the addition of 5 more national parks. I've often found that as president in dealing with Congress, very often that the opposite of progress very often is Congress. So thankfully, one of my allies in Congress, a man named John Lacey, who was a Civil War veteran and representing the state of Iowa, he got through a measure which I never would have imagined he could have got through a Congress. Maybe they would asleep at the wheel that day, but he got through something called the American Antiquities Act. You see here in the American Southwest, a number of these, what passes for ancient history in North America, 1,000 to 2,000-year-old civilizations in these pueblos, they were being raided by the pot hunters and the museums. There was, in fact, a Scandinavian scientist who came down and just was filling up crates to haul back to Europe of American antiquities. There were people who bringing in wagons, teams of oxen pulling great wagons, and they were going to the American Southwest and filling them up with entire trees, petrified trees, what becomes eventually Petrified National Park, Petrified Forest National Park. They were hauling these things off by the cartloads. Congress was not going to act and turn every single one of these sites into a national park and apply federal protection, but John Lacey got through the Antiquities Act. And what did it do? It said that the President of the United States has the power and authority, by the power of the pen, to name something a national monument if it has scientific value, if it has some sort of historic value. Now, granted, the plot should be in the smallest space that is within reason. Several acres were in mind in the Antiquities Act, I suppose, when Congress approved this. They imagined that they would declare 2 or 3 acres around the petrified forest of New Mexico a national monument. If I named that, then so be it, and no harm done. I took that and ran with it. I declared 18 national monuments. Devil's Tower up in Wyoming, perhaps you've seen it. I understand it made it into one of your movie pictures once upon a time. Devil's Tower, my first national monument. I went on to declare 18 national monuments. One of them, the Wheeler National Monument here in Colorado, I understand over time it lost its national monument status and is now a geological feature, as it's called, but still something of wonder. So again, Congress had in mind the smallest acreage possible surrounding, a few acres surrounding some ruin somewhere, and that would be acceptable. When I went down on a tour as president in 1903, and I saw with my own eyes for the first time the Grand Canyon, which at that time, again, Arizona was still a territory, it was not a state. And the people of the territory of Arizona and the railroads and the mining interests had in mind that they would turn this into one giant extraction pit, that the railroads would build spurs right up to the edge of the canyon, that there would be hotels built all around the perimeter of the canyon. And it broke my heart to think of the Grand Canyon with that future. And for the first time, perhaps in my life, I was struck speechless sight of the Grand Canyon. And what I said to those people at that point is, this grand place, this canyon of the Colorado, the ages have been at work upon this place. Man's hand can only mar this place. Leave it as it is. You can only mar it. Save it for your children and your children's children. This is their national birthright. We are obligated to save this for all future generations of Americans yet unborn. Leave it as it is. I never stopped thinking about the Grand Canyon. I said, this is the one place that all Americans, if it is within their ability in their lifetimes, all Americans need to see the Grand Canyon. Europe has its cathedrals. They have the Notre Dame. They have the Acropolis. We have the Grand Canyon. We have Yellowstone. We have the Yosemite. These are our cathedrals. We have the tremendous sequoias and redwoods of California. I spent the night with John Muir, as you probably know, what they described as one of the most famous camping trips in American history. When I was on tour in 1903, I had written Mr. Muir and said, I would be delighted if I could spend just a couple of days with you, John. You showing me around your beloved Yosemite. I just wanted it to be the two of us. And of course, when I arrived, there were these horrible signs nailed up to these giant sequoias and redwoods and said, welcome, Mr. President, welcome, welcome, Mr. Roosevelt, we're so glad to have you. And they had, now understand, they had hollowed out the trunk of one of these grand trees that were saplings when Christ walked the earth. And they had hollowed it out and built a road through it just for the amusement of the tourist. This is a disgraceful vandalism of God's creation. I said, I'm going to leave for a few moments. And when I come back, if I see those signs have been taken down and every reference to my visit has been removed, I may speak to you for a moment. But if not, then just leave my sight. And they took them down. And I went off for a couple of days, spent just in the company of Mr. Muir. And it was glorious. Being out there camping for 2 days with this beloved naturalist, John Muir, this harmless little Scottish immigrant, long in the beard, whitened with age, but he was the sage of the Sierras. He was the voice of preservation of Yosemite. And it was in that camping trip that he convinced me of the necessity of using the power of my presidency to preserve places like Yosemite, to conserve our resources. If I wasn't already a conservationist, I tell you after that camping trip, he would convince me. Mr. Muir was fond of saying, anything in nature, once man has placed a dollar value upon it, nothing in nature will remain safe. Those words have stuck with me. So yes, as far as conservation, as far as my progressivism is concerned, conservation has been at the head of my progressivism. And I can tell you, when you fight for the right in politics or in civic life, you will get detractors, you'll get the naysayers, people who tell you can't do something. But I want to encourage you with words that I spoke at the Sorbonne in 1910 on citizenship, words that have come down to you as some of my more famous utterings, perhaps. And I said that it isn't the critic who counts. It's not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. No, the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because yes, there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place will never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. My dear friends, I know it is hard to fail, but ask yourselves how much worse it is to have never tried to succeed. I want to encourage you today to spend yourselves in a worthy cause. And when you do so, remember to dare greatly. Thank you very much, good citizens. For this kind invitation to join you here this afternoon, and thank you to the Park County Historical Society for the work that you are doing to preserve the history and heritage of this region. Now, as president, you may or may not know that I was the first president to have the press corps give them permanent space in the White House. And, there would be times once or twice a day the press corps, they would actually come into my office in the White House, and I would answer their questions. And so in that spirit, if there are questions that you may have for me, I would be delighted to try to take them on at this time. Yes, sir.
Will you run again?
Will I run again? As I said, this Colorado air has made me feel fully fit as a bull moose. The words that I uttered in the 1912 campaign, you may know that I served before there was a constitutional limit on terms as president. And when I was elected in my own right, in election night of 1904, I said that my first term I would consider to be my first full term that I inherited from Mr. McKinley through the graveyard, and this next term that I just won by overwhelming approval of the American people would be considered my second term, and that in the heritage of the great presidents that came before me, but particularly Mr. Washington, I would only serve 2 terms as president. And as soon as I said those words, I would give anything. I would give my left arm to take those words back. The dumbest thing I ever said in my life. I enjoyed being president, and I believe I could have been reelected in 1908. My hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, won the presidency in 1908. Now, I left the country for a year on that African hunting trip for the Smithsonian, and when I came back, I discovered that my hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, had not followed my progressive agenda, that he had begun to cave into the conservative, reactionary, Republican arm of our party, and begun to dismantle some of the things that I had worked for as president, which angered me very much. So over the next couple of years, I determined that in 1912, I was going to again run for the presidency, for the Republican nomination. And I won 8 of the 12 primaries that spring. And at the convention, I had it stolen from me. I had it stolen from me by the Republican bosses who still ran the party. Mr. Taft, probably and his cronies, ensured that I wasn't to receive the nomination. 8 of the 12 12 primaries, and 2 had been won by Mr. Follett, a progressive candidate. So the delegates of that convention left that hall, and within a couple of weeks had marched across the street, Chicago, and we formed a new party to be called the Progressive Party. And I declared myself healthy as a bull moose, stripped to the waist, my hat is in the ring. And it became known as the Bull Moose Party. And I came in second in that election. Mr. Taft came in a dismal 3rd place, didn't even win his home state of Ohio. And I got 27% of the popular vote. But unfortunately, we split the Republican Party vote, and that terrible Mr. Wilson, that professor from Princeton, made it into the White House just in time for the first Great War to come about. Here I was, out of the White House when the first Great War comes about. Mr. Wilson, you may know, said that how strange it would be if fate dictated that his administration would be one of foreign affairs, because he felt utterly unequipped for it. I can agree with that. So yes, sir, I feel fit, tanned, and ready for 2024. The teddy bear story. I didn't bring a teddy bear with me. It can be somewhat of a distraction if people see a cute little teddy bear behind me. But yes, but how very strange is the teddy bear story. Of all of my achievements in my political life, my personal life, that I would be known for a failure. And in this case, a failed bear hunt. Early in my presidency, you see, I was invited down to Mississippi by the governor there. I had some political business to take care of, and while I was there, I was invited to go on a bear hunt in the southern canebrakes there, black bears. And so I said, yes, that would be a bully thing to do, to add to my trip. Anytime I can add hunting to a political trip, I would be in favor of that. But as you can imagine, those of you who hunt, you know that you can either have a successful hunt or a big family picnic, but you can't have both at the same time. We had reporters and all these other hangers-on and these political strap hangers with us, and dozens of people, and we created such a ruckus through the southern canebrakes, probably scared every bear off in the southern delta. For 3 days, I unsuccessfully hunted in southern Mississippi. Finally, I retreated back to our camp, and one day a man comes running into the camp and said, President Roosevelt, you have to come quick, we have your bear. So I grabbed the Winchester and off I went and arrived at the scene of these dozens of men standing around a pack of howling, hunting dogs, and I arrived and there's 2 of the dogs have been killed and several of the others are mauled. It's a big bloody mess, and in the middle of it is this 250-pound, grizzled, beaten, bloody bear. You see, they didn't want to shoot it yet, so they beat it over the head with the butts of their rifles, tied to a tree. They said, Mr. Roosevelt, there's your bear. Now, I had founded the Boone and Crockett Club that was predicated upon fair chase rules and ethical hunting practices. I said, what do you expect me to do with this? So I refused to shoot the bear. Now, there were reporters present. And the word went out the next day across the wires, across the nation, that President Roosevelt had spared the life of a bear. And then the cartoonists got involved, as they will. I've noticed some budding cartoonists over here. What have you been doing to my picture? You look at that. You are busted, as they say. And this cartoonist by the name of Berryman had drawn up the scene of this bear hunt and instead of this grizzled, beaten, bloody bear, had portrayed it as this cute, frightened little bear cub on the end of a rope, and a picture of me standing with my back turned, my arm extended, and entitled Drawing the Line in Mississippi. This became, as you would say, it went viral. This is the image of me for the rest of my presidency, for the rest of my life. That little cartoonish bear cub followed me around in every political cartoon of my life. And when I returned back to the White House, I had a letter from a toy maker, Mr. Morris Mictum, and he said, Mr. Roosevelt, my wife has started sewing up these little stuffed animals, and we wondered if we could use your name in the promotion of these products. So I wrote back, I can't imagine that the Roosevelt name would do much good in the toy bear business, but yes, you have my permission. The rest is history. Teddy's Bear, as it was called that year, became an overnight hit, one of the enduring childhood favorite toys. There's worse things to be associated with. Thank you for asking. Yes, sir. Another question.
I was wondering if we can recollect riding the Colorado and Southern Railroad up here.
If I can recollect it, I can recollect riding there was a train that came from Colorado Springs up to the Gold Camp region. That one in particular comes to my mind when I was taken back up to the gold fields and given such a grand return, and it had been recently constructed. I don't know if you've been on the Gold Camp Road from Colorado Springs up into the Victor Cripple Creek region, but I rode that and I thought that I knew Colorado, but I was astonished at the views on the Gold Camp Road, that railway, and I said that it was scenery that defies the English language, challenges the English language, and of course that made it into the promotional materials I've understood ever since. But yes, I have. You will have to pardon me if I don't recall that particular trip. I have ridden so many trains in my lifetime. I have crossed this nation time and time and time again, hundreds of thousands of miles, as you would say, frequent flyer miles that I have piled up on the rails of this nation. So yes.
Our book over here, the Life and Times of Barb Tripp, she told me that her grandmother, the Secret Service, came up here. And when they inspected Glen Isle, it did not meet your Secret Service's standards, and that you stayed at the Blue Jay Inn in Buffalo Creek.
If you were to, I understand if Roosevelt slept here. It was the Meeker Hotel. I know for a fact.
We have your signature on our way station at the park too.
That is bully. Maybe that'll bring back some good old memories for me to go down there and check out your historical societies.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you remember fishing the Swan River Ranch just a few miles away, and your Secret Service would be on the base?
That was Eisenhower.
That was Eisenhower?
I was drawing a blank there. Thank you very much, sir. I'm a teetotaler, I typically remember these things, but yeah, I didn't recall that. I was never as fond of fishing as I had an uncle that was one of the great the writers on fishing in America, and but I never really took to fishing that much. I enjoyed the hunt and the chase. I understand that the angler will still consider it the chase. It doesn't hold quite the same level of excitement for me to dangle a hook in front of a fish as to stalk a quadruped across the plains and the mountains of North America. Yes, ma'am.
The quote, no one knows how much, cares how much you know until they know how much you care.
It is. Now, I've seen that attributed to a number of people, but I did say that in a number of different ways, but it is true that this is something that I know is a mantra of public school teachers, that that the kids will not perform unless they know how much that you actually care about them as individuals. And I have found this to be true in my personal life and in politics. That I truly believe that people will not care about your policies if they know they don't come from a position of actual compassion. And I believe I learned compassion from that greatest man that I ever knew. Again, my father, called him Greatheart, and he was one of the great philanthropists of New York City. In his day, he had helped found the Metropolitan Art Museum and the American Museum of Natural History, but even more importantly, he helped found the Children's Hospital, orthopedic hospital, which provided free operations for the crippled children of New York, couldn't afford them. He was also a founder of the Children's Aid Society of New York, which gave families aid, but particularly found homes in the American West and farm families and ranch families for the orphans on the streets of New York City. One more story here that comes to mind. When I was governor of the state of New York, I was at a conference of American governors, and this man comes up to me and says, "Mr. Roosevelt, I'm pleased to make your acquaintance. Delighted to make your acquaintance. I'm the territorial governor of Alaska. I wanted to make your acquaintance. I've been eager to meet you, sir, not as the governor of the state of New York, but as the son of Theodore Roosevelt Sr. Your father changed the destiny of my life. I was an orphaned child on the streets of New York City, and your father helped get me adopted into a loving Western family, and I owe the success of my life to your father." What a testament. My father lived out the gospel. Think the book of James. My father lived the book of James every day. As president, I was sworn into the scripture of 1 James chapter verse 22, that thou shalt not only be hearers of the word, but doers of the word also. My father lived that scripture. He looked out. True religion to him was looking out after the widows and orphans of New York. So compassion is something I learned the traits of strength and courage and manliness from my father, but I believe I also absorbed in him the traits of compassion from my fellow man. Thank you for bringing up that great remembrance of my father.
When you first started talking about when your word bully came out, my brain had a hard time translating at first because it means something different now. Where does this bully come from?
Bully is simply an exclamation of excitement and pride in something that is good. I was fond of probably overusing the term bully. It became a bit of a signature word, but it is true. A senator came up to me once in my presidency. I had been droning on about conservation issues or some such thing, and he said, "Mr. Roosevelt, you are preaching." I said, "Senator, you are right. And the presidency is a bully pulpit from which to preach to the American people." Boy!
What about Alice?
I'm sorry?
What about Alice, your eldest daughter?
Oh, my daughter Alice. She always has a question of curiosity. So my daughter Alice, she outlived us all. Lived to be, I believe, 94, 95 years old, settled in Washington, D.C. She became known as the second Washington Monument. She was a handful, I can tell you. I said she was 17 when I entered the presidency, so to have a beautiful, vivacious 17-year-old daughter in front of the American people with all of the publicity of the press corps. Now, I like the press. I like the attention of the press. Daughter Alice, I guess she said of me that father always wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the baby at every baptism and the corpse at every funeral. But Alice truly took the cake in this regard. She was a handful. She would She smoked, do you know? I didn't approve of smoking or drinking, but particularly in the People's House in the White House. I said, Alice, that you will not smoke under my roof. She was seen later then, on top of the roof smoking. She kept in her purse at state dinners, she would take out this small little green snake out of her purse and introduce it as Emily Spinach to the assembled guests at state dinners. Created such a ruckus. She flirted with the military members in the White House. She flirted with members of the Secret Service. Just to get attention. And finally one day one of my friends came up and said, Theodore, isn't there something you can do about Alice? Can't you control Alice? You're the President of the United States. I said, I can either be President of the United States or I can control Alice Roosevelt. But I can't possibly do both. So yes, everybody probably has an Alice Roosevelt in their lives, and we should. One final story on Alice, as I understand, later in life, in her parlor there in Washington, D.C., she would regularly entertain guests, and she apparently had on a pillow embroidered, "If you don't have anything nice to say about someone, come sit here next to me."